Welcome to America's Talking. I'm your host, Cole McNeely. Last episode on America's Talking, we discussed the issue of the migrant crisis that the United States is facing. One of the things that the migrant crisis has played into, and it's not exclusively the migrant crisis, is the issue of homelessness. When we talk about homelessness, we often see homelessness be a byproduct, the end result of a lot of different things. Today, we're going to talk about a couple of those things. We look at drug abuse. We look at the rising cost of housing, the rising cost of living with inflation the last couple of years, and really the unique strategies that local municipalities and states are taking to try to address this homelessness issue that we're seeing, largely to no avail. Joining me to discuss this today is Tom Gantert. Tom is a managing editor for the Center Square. Tom, how are you?
Good.
We also have Spencer Pauley, who's a Washington State reporter for the Center Square. Spencer, how are you doing out west?
Not too bad here. A little rainy, but otherwise pretty good.
And then we also have Kenneth Schrupp staying on the West Coast. Kenneth, how are you, sir?
Hey, Cole. I'm well. It is fantastic out here in Southern California.
You know, as I mentioned, gentlemen, we're discussing the topic of homelessness today. This is obviously a topic that has impacted states all around the country. I kind of want to do a lay of the land of what is actually happening across the United States when it comes to homelessness. And Tom, I want to start with you. You do a lot of the national coverage. You've looked at this topic from West Coast, East Coast, Midwest. I mean, this is an issue that is everywhere.
Yeah. So it starts out right now. Currently, there's a lot of municipalities that are either starting or just finishing up their annual count. And basically what happens is some of the larger municipalities that are dealing with homelessness send out groups of people, volunteers, to go count. And that is what funding's based on. So in 2023, the Department of Housing and Urban Development estimated there's about 653,000 homeless people in the U.S. That is an increase, about a 12% increase from the previous year. So the current count for 2024 is going on right now. Minorities were overrepresented. There was more African Americans considered homeless than was the percentage population in the U.S. And I guess the overall theme that municipalities are doing is the dollars don't match the demand. That's the message that they're sending out. So what's interesting is that many of the municipalities are using federal COVID relief money to fund these homeless initiatives. And that funding ends for the most part this year, 2024. So that's one of the bigger questions going to be is, where are you going to get the money to keep these programs going? And it varies. Wisconsin has $16.5 million in the state budget this year for homelessness, the state budget. The city of San Francisco's Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing has an annual budget right now of about $310 million. So it depends on what region of the country you are in terms of how costly it is, but just about every state is dealing with homelessness as an issue.
And Tom, I'm going to stick with you real quick. So when we talk about homelessness, is there a general definition of what that means, a general frame of reference that we should look at this through, that when we say homelessness, it means this?
The definitions I've seen are the ones where they describe it as people without housing. Now, they also have sheltered and unsheltered. So a lot of times what happens is there's people that are just living out on the street under a bridge. That'd be unsheltered. And then there's people that are homeless that they take in and give them temporary housing. So they break it into two categories, but that's generally the definitions that they use.
Yeah, and I know there has been some verbiage changes around, I've heard unhoused people used before, unsheltered, as you mentioned, Tom. So I just wanted to get that out, kind of out the gate before we get too deep into this conversation of exactly what we're talking about. I want to bring Kenneth in real quick. Kenneth, you're out in California. This has hit the West Coast pretty badly. We'll hear from Spencer Pauley in just a minute talking about Washington. But in California, I mean, we're seeing housing issues, drug issues.
Well, we have 181,000 homeless people in California, and despite having the largest state population, we still have the highest rate of homelessness per capita of any state in the nation. We spent about $25 billion on state funding and homelessness since 2018, with most of that going towards what are called housing first policies that first aim to put people into some kind of housing before getting them treatment for substance abuse disorders or mental health. This includes housing the homeless in hotels. We spend a few $100s a night on that, buying hotels and converting them to permanent homeless facilities, a couple $100,000 a year per hotel room. Plus, we're spending tens of grand a year on services for each of these people in these converted hotels. And then building these supportive housing units for homeless that cost up to about $1 million per unit and are being built in some of the most expensive neighborhoods in the entire country. Early in the lockdown era, California government even gave homeless individuals not just housing, but drugs and alcohol to get them off the streets. So we had government-sponsored alcohol and drug supply drops for homeless. We do know that about 67% of homeless do have mental health or substance abuse disorders. So this would line up with some incentives to get them inside, but really is at what cost are we doing this and at what level of efficiency?
Yeah, and you mentioned housing being an issue. I mean, since COVID, we've had inflation, right? So inflation, cost of living in general has gone up. Housing has obviously skyrocketed. I mean, we've seen it, kind of hit a level of sorts in the last year or so here. How much of that is playing in California is just, people maybe being priced out of those, lower homes, that lower tier really being hurt by the combination of increased housing prices, but just inflation and cost of living in general?
Admittedly, there are a lot of people who are being forced out due to the cost of housing in California. If you already are having a substance abuse problem or mental illness, if you can at least have really cheap housing available at market rates in your area, you're not going to end up on the streets and your condition is much more manageable while you still are living in a place that you can afford to pay for on your own with some minimum wage job. Well, it's also worth noting that about a third of homeless in California, well, at least in Los Angeles, did not become homeless in LA County, suggesting we probably have similar numbers across the state where it just happens to be that 2/3 of the people became homeless in California, but another third did not. But if we look at California housing in general, we do see that we largely stopped building housing after 1970 with the adoption of the California Environmental Quality Act that allows almost any project to be stopped by anyone anywhere in the state or even the country that finds some kind of environmental reason to force environmental impact review after environmental impact review, and it leaves developers not wanting to build in California. You also have this phenomenon called inclusionary zoning, where noting that due to California regulations, it is so expensive to build housing for anyone that developers only focus on building higher end housing for higher income individuals, that they're now mandating that developers build a lot of these money-losing inclusionary zoning housing units where they're only allowed to build if they will build quote-unquote affordable housing that is just price-controlled housing for lower-income Californians.
And let's head north here a little bit. I'm going to bring in Spencer Pauley, who's the Center Square's Washington state reporter, or one of the reporters up there. Spencer, we'll get into Seattle in just a little bit, kind of down to that city level. As a state, Washington's interesting. You have a lot of rural areas. And how is this issue impacting beyond the metropolitan areas, beyond Seattle? I mean, how is this impacting the state as a whole?
So homelessness in Washington is spread out. By last year's point in time count, there were about 28,000 people in all of Washington state that are homeless. About half of that is in the Seattle-King County region. But you can look elsewhere to see growing statistics as well. Pierce County with 2,000, Spokane all the way over in eastern Washington has over 2,000. It's very much spread out. You're seeing cities in southern King County like Vancouver or southern Washington calling for declaring a state of emergency due to the homelessness crisis. It's getting worse and worse throughout the state.
Well, how are, local law enforcement handling this in different areas of the state? Because I know in Washington in particular, there has been some, it's called strife, disagreement of, local law enforcement. Am I thinking right on that one, Spencer?
A lot of law enforcement is growing frustrated with the way the state can handle people who are homeless, who are causing issues through the communities. The issue is, however, is that a lot of these jails and prisons don't have enough space to hold these people in. So if they get arrested, they get turned over after a certain amount of hours and they're not sitting in jail or prison. So they're being left back into their community. That is one of the biggest issues facing the state, is a lack of seats in jails and prisons. So what you're seeing is homeless people just doing what they want and are not able to face any repercussions or consequences.
And really, I mean, Tom, I want to come back to you here, but there's a disconnect across the board between what is actually happening on the ground and then the infrastructure to deal with it. I mean, that sounds like the repeated problem you hear almost everywhere, which is these numbers are going up. You mentioned, I think, 12% over the last year, and taxpayers are picking up the bill. But how much of this infrastructure is just lagging behind the issue as it is on the ground?
Well, a lot of the communities like Berkeley, California, Austin, Texas, and even Denver are experimenting with how to just get these homeless people housed. And one of the things that we've seen is a couple things. They've even looked at metal shipping containers, turning them into small, what we'd call micro homes. Some communities that looked at that. Austin, Texas has a community of tiny homes that right now California and Colorado are pointing to as the model. And basically what this is they call them homes, tiny homes that are really no bigger than sheds. So one room area basically has a roof, and these people are able to live in a community. Denver calls theirs a micro community, and they spent $2 million in Denver. And the facility has staff available 24/7 on site. It includes community kitchens and laundry facilities and restrooms. And that's how they're trying to deal with it is to just get them housed and then deal with the other issues which come with mental illness and addiction. And, some of these communities come with those people embedded in the community to help out.
And Kenneth, I'm going to head back out to California real quick. Tom, you mentioned it's impacting other issues. One of those things we're seeing too, crime. And in California, Kenneth, we've got essentially a situation where they made serial theft not a felony, but it sounds like they're trying to get things moved back toward that with some law enforcement groups. How about just some of those other issues outside of the housing issue? We're seeing crime and that sort of thing. How's that impacting, policy life really in California?
Right. So in 2014, we passed something called Proposition 47, which made theft under $950 into a misdemeanor that prosecutors, quite frankly, don't have the bandwidth to prosecute because we just don't have enough prosecutors. It required also that thefts be $950 in value, not retail price, and that this be in a single incident. So now you can go into a store, keep stealing $950 of stuff over and over, and you're probably not going to get prosecuted. Because of this, there's a new proposition that is hitting the signature count now. They already got 25% of the signatures in just 30 days. I had a story on that a couple days ago. This is sponsored by Walmart, Target, and a bunch of law enforcement groups. And it would make it so that if you are stealing, you can combine all of your theft into a single grand theft charge for $950 and get charged with a new kind of felony if you're found to have some kind of drug or substance abuse condition. This is called a treatment mandated felony that recognizes where you might be stealing to support your drug addiction. It even says so in this proposition that we've just really allowed people to serially steal to support drug addiction. In Mission District in San Francisco, there are people who just steal goods, sell them to street vendors, and the street vendors resell them. So you can go on streets in San Francisco and just pick up goods from Walmart and Target that have been stolen and buy them at a fraction of the retail price. With this treatment mandated felony, you're going to have to complete treatment, but this will be an alternative to jail because we do recognize also that the largest provider of mental health care services in California is the prison system. This could create a very positive enforcement mechanism for getting people into the treatment they need, where other mechanisms such as conservatorship have just been not able to keep up with the influx of people. Another thing to note, though, is that we do have a ballot measure coming in March of this year that voters can vote on that would create a $9.3 billion bond to build 11,150 new behavioral health beds, 26,700 outpatient treatment slots, and $1 billion of veterans housing. So this would create the physical infrastructure we need to get people into the treatment that is really keeping them on the streets.
And Kenneth, you just mentioned drugs there. This is incredibly, we're seeing drug problems all across the country. It's incredibly sad. I think it's easy when you talk about issues like this to talk about it as kind of the abstract, but these are obviously people, and it's so sad to hear. And Spencer, I think everybody has heard about a lot of the challenges that the city of Seattle has faced. You are in Seattle. You're recording currently from Seattle. What is it like on the ground in Seattle? What are you seeing?
A block away, there's a huge encampment of homeless people. You see a lot of open drug use. This is just what I see personally in my daily life. But statistics show that there was over 1,200 overdose deaths in last year, and that smashed the previous record, which was in 2022 of exactly 1,000. The scary thing is that out of those 1,200 overdose deaths, over 1,000 of them were attributed to fentanyl. That is the biggest thing hitting this area, this region, and the state that we are seeing here. So we're seeing Seattle Mayor Bruce Harrell issuing an executive order prioritizing treatment for these people and working with law enforcement to hold dealers accountable, kind of nipping at the bud here is what you're seeing. Other than that, this homelessness issue, the city of Seattle and King County are using a housing first approach. At a state level, we're seeing Washington needs over 1 million homes by 2041. King County itself is trying to secure about 1,600 units of supportive housing through purchasing old hotel buildings and turning them over to affordable housing. This is the county's approach. City of Seattle itself spends about $1 billion over a decade on homelessness. This is frustrating due to the increasing number of homeless people. I think alone in this year, the city is spending about $162 million on homelessness.
We're seeing the frustration on regular citizens too, because in September in Denver, there was a story about John Caldera, who runs a nonprofit, and he took human excrement and dropped it on the steps of the city hall. And the reason he did it is because he was tired, he said, of seeing drug needles, condoms, and trash all around his business, which was down a couple blocks away. So there's that aspect of it too, is that the people who are not homeless are frustrated with the street carnage of what's going on.
And Spencer, I mean, you just mentioned $1 billion spent on this initiative, right? I mean, it's over a decade.
Yep. For the city alone.
Right, for the city of Seattle. We're continuing to see increasing numbers. There's two things. I mean, one is it showing that anything is working? So that's question one. And then question two, and you can answer this in one thing. And is anything working? And have they changed course over the last decade when seemingly it's not working? Or at least maybe the rates are going up at a slower rate. I mean, maybe this is kind of like inflation, right? Where it's like, well, we're lowering the rate of it going up. But is there any change in course? Is there any evidence of what has been successful in Seattle? They made a massive investment.
So just because the number of homeless people is continuing to increase, nothing's working. I think the last program that the King County Regional Homelessness Authority implemented was this pilot program that focused resources on the downtown Seattle area, which they believed was the core of the homelessness issue. This costs millions of dollars, and it only housed 230 people. This is not as much as the area consists of homeless people there. So we're seeing that agency transition into this housing first approach, which means that that's estimated to cost between $450 million to $1.1 billion a year over the next decade to fill the number of housing needs. So instead of just focusing resources on one particular area, this agency is kind of spreading out its resources and focusing on building up housing. Like Tom mentioned before, we're seeing these tiny home villages being built. The issue is that they can fund these nonprofit organizations to run these, but it's about, I think, $900,000 and $1.1 million to run this for about a year. And these nonprofits are not receiving enough funds to keep it going for, a certain amount of time, especially 1 year. It's just cost too much.
Tom, and let's wrap up here with you. I mean, when we look at this issue, this is an issue that is seemingly we've heard drugs talked about, we heard housing prices talked about. This issue seems like a byproduct of other issues that the country is facing. What do we see nationally? Is there anything working? I mean, how do places even try to start addressing this and making any inroads beyond just seeing if something will work? I mean, is there anything that we see across the board that could address this?
Any solution is going to cost money. And I think going forward, to me, the most compelling question going forward is, how are you going to fund these initiatives? Now, right now in Denver, we wrote about a basic income program, which is going to pay cash to homeless people. And in Denver, migrants were eligible for this program. Okay. So right now, what we're seeing is more of an emphasis on trying to just get them in some type of shelter. That's tremendously costly. And they have the money to do it right now because of all the COVID federal money. Once that runs out, it's going to be really interesting to see what comes up from that. Either they're going to have to go to the federal government for a lot more money, or they're going to have to get it state and locally, or they're going to have to stop doing these initiatives that, are very expensive in terms of housing people. And what we're seeing is that some of these budgets in municipalities are doubling in what they're paying in housing. And that's going to come to an end in 2024. So this next couple years is going to be interesting to see where the revenue comes from, the streaming revenue, to keep these initiatives going.
And we really didn't even touch on it. Tom, you did a little bit there, and it kind of popped in my head. But dealing with this issue, we really didn't even talk about the migrant crisis of the millions of people who are coming across the border. And, if there's a housing shortage, there's not a lot of places they can go either. Right? Does this contribute to this? Have we seen this?
Oh, yes. It's especially in the sanctuary cities where they're being bused specifically, because that's the communities that are being targeted right now. And, Governor Abbott in Texas is shipping them continually to these sanctuary cities. There's 6 of them he's targeting that are getting every day busloads of migrants who are homeless.
Yeah. Listeners, you can check out all the stories we talked about today at thecentersquare.com. A lot of factors playing into this. We heard drugs, housing cost, living cost, immigration. Across the board, almost everything that we're seeing right now is playing into this homelessness issue we're seeing in a lot of places and a lot of big cities in particular. Tom, Spencer, Kenneth, I want to thank you all for joining us today on America's Talking. And for you listeners, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any episode of America's Talking. You can check out all of our great America's Talking Network podcasts at americastalking.com. Again, thanks for listening, and please subscribe.
Audible is a great way to gain access to an ever-growing selection of audiobooks. They've got what everyone's listening to: bestsellers, new releases, that story you've been waiting for. Follow the link in our show description to get 30 days of Audible free.